I'm Professor Marc-André Léger, and this is the recording for week 4 of Business Technology Management, Business Information Systems Risk, Security and Audit, BTM 440. In this lecture, we're covering U.S. compliance laws, and I do want to remind you that these are the laws that apply to for information security and standards in the United States. So we're going to look at those from a Canadian perspective as we're located in Canada, and our focus is on Canadian issues, but this also connects to the use of American laws, as many organizations are multinational and so do operate in the US regulatory space. However, some of those are less relevant, and so we might be going quickly over those. So as you'll notice, this is a big slide deck, and we're not going to cover everything, but the main idea of compliance is important to us. This is an important issue for businesses as it relates to cybersecurity. The idea that as an organization we need to comply with some laws and regulations. Also, we have contractual obligations that make us need to comply to certain standards as well. And we will want to implement some frameworks, such as the Nist risk management framework, which will help us to put in place quote unquote good information security best practices, or ways of doing things that have shown to be successful for many organizations and have led to the creation of risk management frameworks or international standards. So, but when we are talking about compliance, we are focusing more on the legal aspects. So, depending what sector of activity we're in, we may have national laws, regional laws, international treaties, or international agreements that would apply to us, depending of our sector of activity. In the US, as in Canada, organizations that have sensitive data, in particular personal identifiable information, PII, so basically what we might think of as private data, there are certain laws that require us to protect this data. Whether we're in Europe, in the US, in Canada, they are equivalent laws. Some of those are a little bit different, but they tend to be gradually evolving to become more similar. And that's certainly the case in matters of data protection law and privacy. So currently the EU Gdpr, so the general data protection rules in the European Union, are much more strict, but California is adopting similar laws now, and Quebec in Canada as well. So these are becoming more and more similar over time as people adapt. I do want to remind you that respecting laws is not an option. It's a legal obligation to respect the law. So, as it relates to these, particularly to personally identified information, PII, we need to we need to comply with the different regulations in this regard. So when we're talking about personally identifiable information, this includes your first, middle, last name, your home mailing address, your social security number, your driver's license, your Medicare card number, your financial account data, all your health data, biometric data, and all your authentication credentials. So user IDs and password that you're using to connect to the various systems. So these are all considered PII, and these are all going to be covered particularly by many of the laws and regulations and standards that we have to deal with. So as an organization, from a legal standpoint, we obviously are required to follow the laws and regulations that applies to us and to our industry. However, in order to do that, we need to interpret them in a way that the policies and procedures So the documents that we're going to be using internally can be defined, can be understood. So this is a very delicate situation, particularly in the context of Quebec. So our context here, where legally there's there's a law that declares who is allowed to interpret or to make opinions about how laws apply to people and to organizations. In Quebec, only lawyers and certified notaries are the people who are allowed to give legal opinions. In a educational context, professors as well, law professors may as well do that. Obviously, judges is a whole different thing, because at that point it's not really interpreting them in an organizational context, but it's once it gets to court. So, but at the same time, people like me, cybersecurity professionals in organizations, we can't always necessarily go and talk to a lawyer every time we need to make a decision or apply certain regulations in the context of our work. So this is a very delicate balance. But legally, in most jurisdictions, and it is the case in Quebec, only lawyers can give legal opinions. So there's the law on the Quebec Bar Law Association law that applies, and it defines that only lawyers can do things like that. And in some cases, corporate law can also be interpreted by certified notaries, which has a legal sense in Quebec that is different from the rest of Canada and most of the common law countries, because we have civil law that applies in Quebec as well as common law for historical reasons. So from an organizational point of view, we need to create policies. So we need to have a security policy. We mentioned that in a previous class before. But then the main security policy will lead to other levels of more detailed policies. We're going to create standards. We're going to create operating procedures. We're going to create guidelines, and that are going to need to be followed by the different stakeholders inside of the organization. And so as cybersecurity professionals, people working in the field of governance, risk management, and compliance, GRC, in the organization, we're going to be putting in place this structure of governance that's going to help the different individuals that need to apply them in their day-to-day jobs. It'll help guide them in doing what they need to do. So this is an expertise that has to be developed inside the organization, and this has to be done in coordination with the legal departments to ensure that we don't make any errors, that we stay within the limits of the law. So privacy and information security are related. Privacy, if you, and maybe this is a discussion that we can have in the Q&A session if it's something that you're not familiar with. But hopefully in your other courses, such as COM226, the core program course that relates to information technology, you had this discussion, which I normally have with my students, about the difference between ethics, the law, and privacy, and this concept that privacy is a human right. And so you as an individual, you have a right to choose, how your private information is disclosed. But there's also laws that apply to that. And like in Quebec, the law on access to information, or PIPEDA at the Canadian federal level, and other laws that apply in specific areas, as similar to the ones that we'll be talking about or going over in this presentation. But because of this obligation that we have to follow these laws that concern privacy of information, then we have to keep certain information confidential. So what we're doing in information security, if you remember CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability, so that's what we're looking at, confidentiality. And so privacy, as it applies to how we need to manage information, gives us some confidentiality obligations. So in cybersecurity, we're managing confidentiality, and some of the confidentiality that we need to maintain is due to the privacy regulations that we need to follow. So I hope that is perhaps helps you to understand how these are connected. So when we have an obligation of privacy towards a customer, the customer will inform us to, will give us permission to use this personal data because he wants some services from us. And in exchange for that, to maintain the confidence of the customer and to maintain our reputation as an organization, we'll put in place certain confidentiality controls and guidelines so that we will fix inside of our organizational policies, procedures, practices, business processes, how we can use, how we can maintain, how we can copy, how we can transmit this private information of customers, which for us is confidential information. So I hope that makes sense. Again, perhaps it's something that we can explore a little bit more in the Q&A if this isn't clear to you. So federal information security, again, this is in the U.S. context. So in the federal government being a very large creator and user of information in the U.S., and so they have obligations of how they can manage information because obviously, information is very critical for the operation of the government in order to do what they're doing. As well, the government has to maintain a lot of very, very sensitive military data. This presentation, as I said, is in the context of the US, but you can just change for Canada and it's pretty much the same issues. So there's the Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA, that applies. This applies only to US government agencies, federal agencies, and which requires them to do a certain number of things. So do risk assessment, an annual inventory, policies, procedures, plans, security awareness training, etc. Again, all U.S. agencies must put in place mechanisms to protect the information. They must do a yearly test. They must review their controls and ensure that they have accurate, well-functioning, and sufficient controls in place for the organization. Make sure that they work, and then continuously manage risks. So really, it defines the roles, responsibilities, accountabilities, requirements, practices needed to fully implement the FISMA security control and requirements. So in Canada, we have the equivalent to that. Now in the US, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Nist, creates all the guidelines that federal agencies use for their information security program. And it creates standards that they use to classify the data. It creates guidelines and minimum information security controls for information systems. And it creates the Federal Information Processing Standards, or FIPS, and the special publications. So there's a whole bunch of those FIPS and special publications, which are created for use in the US. But however, we in Canada rely quite heavily on those. They're probably some of the best documentation around on how to implement cybersecurity in organizations. So, for example, in my work, my day-to-day work in cybersecurity, I rely on the National Institute of Science and Technology. Special publications is really at the core of what I do, all the ones that have to do with security awareness, security training, competencies, the workforce planning, which is the area that I'm more active in cybersecurity, and it's all based on NIST standards.